Thank you very much. Yes, I can just about see everyone. You'll have to excuse my voice if it's a bit crackly today. We're still in winter, I think, in the UK, even though it's April, so I've got a nice winter cold, but hopefully you can hear me as we go through. So I'm Matt Blenkinsop. I'm PTFS Europe in the UK, and I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility and Koha. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to try and cover today. Quick introduction to who I am and PTFS Europe for those of you that haven't heard of us. And then I'll do a little bit of background context. So where have we come from in the last couple of years? What steps have we been making or changes in the community to try and deal with accessibility a bit better? And part of that obviously is then the fact that we're a global community, so the global views that we've got on accessibility in the community. I'll have a little bit of a look at how we're tracking accessibility so that you can see what we're doing as a community and in terms of development to try and tackle accessibility issues. And then obviously as part of that, what challenges are we facing? So what makes it difficult for us to actually deal with accessibility as a topic? I've got a case study for one of our customers, so the British Museum in London, that we did some testing with. So I'll give a bit of an overview of what we did there and how that was really, really beneficial. And then I'll finish off with future improvements that we're hoping to make within the community. So what can we do to improve how we handle accessibility? And then hopefully at the end, we might have time for a few questions once I've finished off. So I'm a software engineer. I'm working for PTFS Europe. I've been there for about 18 months. You can see since November 2022. So I'm still fairly new into Koha in the community and also to software development. My job before this was something completely different. So development and also accessibility are still fairly new topics to me. But that being said, I've been one of the accessibility advocates for the last release cycle and in fact the release cycle before. So it's myself for this cycle and also Lucas Gass, who works for Bywater in the US. We're the two accessibility advocates. And obviously the idea of that role is it's called the advocate. It's not necessarily to be an expert on accessibility. I don't pretend to be an expert, but our role is really to try and push the awareness in the community. So doing presentations like this, but also keeping the awareness on developments as they come through to try and make sure that we're not introducing issues. For those of you that are interested in the different roles that we have in community, there's some links here. I'm sure we can share the slides afterwards for those that are interested. You can see what all the roles are that we have and who's obviously occupying those roles at the moment. And then what we also have at the moment is the roles for next cycle are currently open. So we're accepting anyone that's interested in a role. There's lots of roles that aren't necessarily developer focused. There's documentation and things like that, which if there's anyone that's interested in taking a more active role in the community, then I'd urge anyone to go and have a look and see if there's anything you're interested in. So PTFS Europe, we're an open source library solution support company. We're based in the UK and Koha is our sort of main product that we support. We do some work as well with Aspen Discovery and a couple of other smaller products like Metabase and DSpace, but Koha is our main focus. We're currently 24 people with 5 of us in the development team. So 2 or 3 of us tend to work on Koha at any one time and the others then working across the other products. I'd urge you to have a look at our YouTube channel if you haven't already, because we've got a lot of content on there to help with different areas of Koha, but also some sort of introductions to new developments and new features that will come. So if you're interested in seeing what new features we're developing for different versions, then there's lots of content on there as well. So moving on to accessibility and a bit of background. Obviously Koha's coming up to I think nearly 25 years old now as a software, so there's a long history with Koha and also accessibility, and obviously within that there's been highs and lows. So in terms of highs, in July 2020 we actually added some accessibility guidelines into the coding guidelines. So that's what we as developers are referring to when we're working on new features or bug fixes to try and ensure that we're not introducing any problems. So that was a big step to actually introduce those into the guidelines that we're supposed to work within. And then shortly after that, in the October of that year, that's when we created the accessibility advocate role. So obviously, as I talked about earlier, that's to try and push the awareness in the community and keep a focus on that as we're working on sort of the new versions and making sure that we're not regressing in terms of our compliance to standards. Then in KohaCon 2023, which was in Helsinki last year, we actually held an accessibility workshop. So we got a huge number of people together. That was developers, librarians, users. There was a real mix of roles and involvements in the Koha community. And we sort of took a look at the larger issues that we had. A lot of these came out of the case study that I'll go through later. So we worked on defining an accessibility statement, as well as tackling some of the long-standing bugs and issues that we had. It was quite useful to have a group of developers in the room to be able to just sit and work through those together. So that was a really positive session. In terms of lows or challenges, really, I'll cover most of these in more detail later, but just to sort of introduce them now as topics. The big problems we have are with identifying issues and keeping up with the standards because they're constantly changing. Koha as a product is very flexible, but this does make it quite difficult to manage accessibility because that customization itself can cause issues for accessibility. And then I think prior to having the accessibility advocate role, it was never really necessarily given the focus that perhaps it should have been. So it was always worked in quite a piecemeal fashion, and we've never really necessarily had accessibility experts in community. Hence why the advocate role is to try and push awareness of that and try and, you know, if we're doing presentations like this and there are people that are very up to speed with accessibility that want to become more involved, then hopefully they can become aware and try and help and support us. In terms of a global perspective, it's called global perspective on the slide, but obviously I'm in the UK and you guys are in Sweden, so that's where the primary focus of this area is. But in the UK, we're very strictly controlled, so the legislation is very tight for public sector. We are required to comply with the WCAG 2.1 level AA requirements for all public sector sites. And we've only now got about 6 months until that will change to the 2.2 requirements. So there'll be further controls introduced. And this is mandatory for us on all of our tenders. So it's very strict within the UK and the guidelines that we need to operate within. I did do some research about what the situation's like in Sweden. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of that act, but it seems that you're in a very similar position. So your public sector sites are required to be at 2.1 level AA. I don't know when 2.2 is going to come into effect, but it seems to be that throughout the European Union, the standards are quite similar. We're held to quite a strict level. Whereas in other parts of the world, we see that whilst accessibility does have requirements, it's not necessarily held to quite as high a standard. So what that tends to mean sometimes within the community is that the burden of managing accessibility falls to the countries who are being more tightly controlled. So it's less of a priority perhaps for some people than it is for others, and that's where the burden tends to lie. So how are we tracking accessibility? Some of you will be aware of Bugzilla, which is the tool that we use for tracking all of our work within community. Although it's called Bugzilla, it's not necessarily just for bugs in terms of problems in the code. It can be for new features, enhancements, and you can see in the image there that what we now have is one of our components is an accessibility component, which means that we can much more clearly identify which bugs are accessibility issues and they don't get lost sort of in the different areas of Koha that they sit within. So for example, you can see acquisitions there. We don't just put any acquisitions type accessibility issue into there. It sits in its own component so that we can have a much clearer view of where they are. And if I just flip across, hopefully you can see my screen's just changed. But when you look at the search field within Bugzilla, we've got that component there and we can very quickly search and identify these bugs. Within that section then, we've even split them out slightly further. So what we've created are these omnibus style bugs where we try and link the issues that are being raised to the actual sections of the guidelines that they apply to. So this is really just to try and help us categorize them a bit better, but also to try and help in some way to identify patterns? So are there some areas of accessibility that we're maybe struggling with a bit more? Are there issues that we're seeing quite regularly against certain parts of the guidelines? Are there areas where we're quite strong that we maybe need to be aware of to make sure we don't, introduce issues in those areas? So it's all about just trying to make it as clear and visible as possible, so that when we're working on these issues, we can also refer back to past bugs that have been linked to the same area to see what the fixes were and how we've resolved those issues, and use that as a guide really to try and keep consistency as we tackle these issues. So in terms of challenges, I mentioned some of these earlier, obviously, but to go into a bit more detail now, one of the big ones is customization, and we'll see this with the case study that I'll show later. Koha has a huge amount of customization. You can inject custom jQuery and CSS into pages. You can create custom pages. The notice templates are customizable, and also you can create your own HTML customizations to inject into certain parts of different pages, which as a feature is absolutely brilliant. It gives you as the users a huge amount of flexibility with how you want your Koha system to behave. But from an accessibility standpoint, it can be quite a challenge because it's very difficult to predict how these changes are going to affect the page that they're being injected into. So for example, a key requirement within accessibility criteria is that the heading structures on page are very clearly ordered. So you should have a heading level 1, followed by 2, 3, 4, and you should never be jumping between those, which we see that sometimes with things, for example, like the HTML customizations, where those are then injected into the page, if they're not customized correctly, can actually break that heading structure, and you could end up with a heading level 1, 2, 3, and then another 2 again, which to someone navigating the page using something like a screen reader can be quite confusing as to why the heading level has suddenly jumped and they're not sure necessarily anymore where they actually are on the page. So it's a huge benefit that Koha has this flexibility, but from an accessibility standpoint, it is quite difficult, because as developers, to try and control that from an accessibility standpoint could end up restricting these features quite a lot, which we don't want to do because that's such a key benefit that Koha has. The accessibility standards are a constantly moving target. They're constantly evolving, with new assistive technologies that are being developed and new awareness around certain disabilities and how users actually interact with technology. And as mentioned, the requirements can sometimes vary from country to country. So we see slightly different requirements and different levels of control. So it's never a static target that we're striving to achieve. It's a constantly moving target that we need to keep up with, because it's all about making sure that we're compliant as best as we can be and keeping an eye on what the next changes that are being introduced will be so that we can start to prepare for those as well. But I think the biggest challenge that we face, especially as developers, is that identifying issues from an accessibility standpoint is incredibly difficult. When we're just looking at a screen full of code, it's not obvious just to see that there's an accessibility issue, because quite often they don't actually really show themselves until they're in use, and someone who actually is using the page in that way is coming across them. So testing is a huge of huge importance to us. It's very difficult for us to do. There are automated tools that we can use, but they can only really go so far. There's only a certain level of automation that can really identify the issues. And without identifying these issues, we don't know where to target and which bugs to fix. So if there aren't bugs being put into Bugzilla, then we don't know where to start, or what we need to actually be looking at. So that really for us is the biggest challenge, because without knowing the issues, we don't know what we're actually working up against. So moving on from that into the case study, this is where we did actually get some really good comprehensive testing done. So the British Museum are one of our customers, and they actually conducted this themselves. This wasn't done sort of through us, or it wasn't required by us in any way. But they were really good, and they shared all of the correspondence with us. They shared the full report. So they instructed an organisation called the Shaw Trust to conduct some third-party testing on their site. So it was just the OPAC that was tested, not the staff client. And what the Shore Trust do is they do some level of automated testing, but the majority of the testing is actually done manually by users. So they have a really experienced team with a range of disabilities using all sorts of different assistive technologies. And they really test the site to a really sort of great extent. They go into every area of every page with all of these different technologies and try to pick apart and find the issues that we see. And this testing was absolutely invaluable because the automated testing will show an area, will show errors to a certain level. But sometimes you'll pass an automated test, but when you actually get a human user to go through and test that page, they will identify things that the automated testing is missing. For example, I talked about the heading structures earlier. The heading structures will be correct in terms of the page. So an automated test will pass because it will detect no anomalies in those structures. But when we get a user to actually go through, they will identify that although the structure is correct, the descriptive categorizations that we're putting on those headings aren't quite clear enough, and it's not actually that clear what some of those headings are pointing to or what the sections of the page actually refer to. And that's something that the automated testing can't pick up. And it's these sort of issues that are absolutely critical to identify because that's what the user themselves is then experiencing. So this was a really useful exercise that was done, and this was probably, it was about 18 months ago, just as I was starting with PTFS, and this is the biggest, I would say, improvement in accessibility that we've seen in the last couple of years, was on the back of this test because of the number of bugs that we were able to identify and raise and then fix. So in terms of the results, you can see here the numbers are, we were compliant with only 6 out of 18 of the level A requirements and 6 of the 14 level AA requirements. Now, it's worth saying at this point, the site is heavily customized. So there's a huge amount of HTML customizations on the site and a lot of the user JS and user CSS. And so that was really sort of interesting in highlighting just how much these can affect the compliance against the guidelines. There were issues within the core sort of base version of Koha, which is what we were able to identify and fix in terms of the bugs. But a lot of the work that we actually did for the British Museum following this audit to try and increase their compliance was actually working on their customizations. So it was quite an interesting or eye-opening insight into how these this flexibility can actually affect the accessibility guidelines. One of the areas that you can work on to sort of identify this is in having a very clear accessibility statement on the site, and this was something that the report highlighted that Koha didn't have. So if you know that there are certain areas of the site where there are accessibility issues, you can highlight this within an accessibility statement to make it clear to a user that there are issues in certain areas of the page and possibly how to navigate through those. So this is what we worked on at KohaCon in 2023. We got a working group together to sit down and draft some placeholder text that users can then use to create their own accessibility statements. So there's this page on the wiki here, and you can see that there's a huge amount of placeholder text relating to different sections of what's required in an accessibility statement. And all of this is available for anyone to use to build their own accessibility statement from. So I'd urge anyone that's interested in this to go and have a look at that and use that if you don't have a statement yourselves, because that's one of the key areas that we've improved massively in the last year or so. Another interesting thing from the case study was how catalogue records themselves can actually break accessibility. This is sort of a longer term issue that we are going to need to look at. For example, if you have records in different languages. So for example, if your OPAC page, the base language is in English, but you have records that have got Swedish titles, there needs to be something on the page that identifies to a user that the language is about to change from English to Swedish, which when we're just pulling records from a database and injecting them into the page, there's no clear or easy way of how we can identify that. And it might be something that in the future actually needs to be done at the record level itself, rather than at the code level. So this is, again, one of the long-term fixes that this report identified, which we probably would never have really identified without testing such as this. So in terms of future improvements, we've just had a look at the accessibility statement, and one of the things that we're looking at introducing is to take that placeholder text and draft a accessibility statement for the base version of Koha, or the released version, which will then sit on an accessible custom page within Koha, and the users can then amend that or adapt it to their own use depending on what optimizations they've got, which will be a big improvement because it means that Koha will ship itself with an accessibility statement that the users can then amend to their needs. A longer term goal will be to integrate some automated testing into our quality assurance tools. So all the code that we submit goes through a sign-off and QA process. And what we would like to do is look at integrating some sort of automated testing into that. So it could be for things like color contrast or the HTML structure on the page. But that's a slightly longer term goal because we need to identify which tools would actually be suitable for our needs, how we would integrate these, and obviously some of these tools do have cost impacts, so there would need to be a discussion around funding. But if we are going to talk about funding testing, then the best thing that we can do for Koha is to have regular testing by a recognised body such as the Shore Trust that we saw in the case study. It was the biggest, I would say, awareness that we've had of accessibility issues in years was the basis of that report, or the results of that report. So having some sort of automated testing with user testing coupled with that would be absolutely invaluable. And if we could do that every 6 months after every major Koha release to check that new release for issues, we would then have the rest of the release cycle to fix those issues going into the next release. So we would catch any regressions in the code in terms of accessibility, and also identify any new issues if, for example, the guidelines have just gone through an update, such as the change we're going to have very quickly into version 2.2. That would be probably the best way that we as a community can keep on top of accessibility as a topic. The question for that obviously is how do we fund it? And so one of this presentation really is quite well timed because 2 weeks ago we were in Marseille for the Hackfest, which some of you may have heard of. It's sort of, I guess, painted as a developer Hackfest, but really it's for everyone. So we have librarians, we have users, we have all sorts of roles that come together for that event, and it's a really good event. And 2 weeks ago, we had a discussion where a proposal was put forward to move Koha into a foundation. So there were a few foundations discussed. I think the favourite at the moment is the Open Library Foundation. But as I say, this is only 2 weeks ago. It's a very new topic. So there'll be a lot more detail coming out soon in the newsletter or on mailing lists. So keep an eye out for that. And there'll be a community level vote before anything around that topic would happen, which obviously everyone will be eligible to vote in. But the reason it's relevant to this presentation is that having a foundation would now allow us to manage funding for this sort of thing at a community level and have a proper structure in place. We would have a community bank account. We would have control over being able to receive donations or funding from people within community and control that at a community level. And one of the key areas that would be really beneficial for is funding testing such as this. So potentially every 6 months or every year, whatever we can reasonably manage. So that would obviously be a really useful way of being able to fund this testing and really improve our focus on accessibility. Obviously, that's still a very new topic and there'll be votes and everything before anything would happen. So if we don't go down that route, then we would look at other routes of funding, whether that would be sort of community requests, so everyone contributing a small amount, or whether we as a PTFS, as a support company, or others look to maybe split the cost across customer bases. But I think funding testing is the key improvement for accessibility that we need to look at. And obviously in the meantime, we are still continuing to tackle any bugs that are raised. So in terms of just rounding up, I think I've got a few minutes left. I think the key point is that we need everyone's help. So everyone can raise bugs, and quite often users such as yourselves are much closer to the end users who have got these accessible requirements than we are, and will maybe hear more about these issues. So if that is the case and people are aware of issues, then please raise bugs so that we can identify these and start to work on them. Just a quick point again about the roles for next cycle. Everyone's welcome. So if you are interested, then please put yourself forward. And there'll be information coming out soon about the move to a foundation. So please keep your eyes open for that as well. And then following Hackfest as well, we've just moved the community IRC chat into a new tool called Mattermost. Very similar sort of to Slack for those of you that have used that or something similar. It's very active and it's a really good tool and everyone's very engaged. So if you're looking to get more involved in the community, then please come and join us. And I think that's everything for me. So if there's a couple of minutes left for questions, I'm not sure, but if there are, then I'll take any questions. Yeah, so the OPAC is generally the priority, as that's obviously where the user focus tends to be. The staff client, if we can get to a point where we're getting more regular testing, then the staff client, we would look to integrate into that as well. But in terms of when we are looking at testing ourselves, the OPAC is always tending to be the priority because that's where we get the most user traffic. So yeah, it's definitely still a topic within the staff client, but the OPAC is for sure the priority. Not that we've seen at the moment, no. There will be solutions out there. Obviously, every sort of software does it slightly differently in terms of how they inject this detail into the page. So the way that we currently do it uses XML, which we need to look at whether there's a solution that we can use within that, or whether to do something like that might involve upgrading how we actually handle that in terms of the concept that we use. Yeah, so part of it is down to the quality of the record can have an impact. You're absolutely correct if it's not marked correctly. But what we have seen is that there are a couple of areas within Koha where we aren't actually able to check and identify as well. So it's sort of it's a combination of the two. The quality of the record can definitely have an impact, and that's something that we did actually see within the British Museum, the case study. But then there are certain areas as well where we aren't quite handling language changes correctly on the page, and that's what we need to try and review.